it's coming up for 6:30, so we're going to get started. But we know that lots of people have subscribed to this event to get the recording later. So if you're watching this recorded or watching just on YouTube, welcome to this interview with me, Tom Sherrington, and John Tomsett. I noticed on the screen it says Thomas Sherrington. It's very formal. And this is our launch. This is our launch of the fantastic book, Cognitive Apprenticeship in Action, edited by John Tomsett. We're going to talk about that because John was very keen that he said that and not by, because it's written as a collaborative thing. And it's the latest in the series of Inaction books that I'm very pleased to have had a hand in assembling the team for. So as I said in one of the previous episodes of this, all I did was basically organize things. But in this case, it was actually John's idea. So we'll talk a little about how the book came to be. And just to sort of remind people that it's available now on the John Catt website, johncattbookshop.com or Amazon. And it goes with the previous ones, which we spoke to Ollie Lovell on this event before, and also Mark and Zoe Enser with their generative learning in action. So, but as a set, it's getting quite exciting. And at the end of this, I'll sort of give you a heads up on the ones that are coming. It's a very exciting process. So, John, how do you feel? Congratulations.
I'm delighted. Yeah, it's been great. And I'm really delighted for all my colleagues who've actually got some of their work in print, and they've been unbearably excited, to use a phrase. It's been great. And what I loved about it was you kind of have an idea, don't you? And we talked it through, and I said to you, why don't we have a series? I've been working on Cognitive Apprenticeship for about 5 or 6 years now, and I suggested let's have an Inaction series to follow the huge success of your Rosenshine book. And I dug out my first email to my colleagues, which was the 27th of February last year. And it was published on the 26th of February this year. So it took 364 days to complete, which I just love that circularity of the whole thing. It came almost entirely 1 year during one of the kind of horriblest years. And I think one of the reasons I was so keen to do it and to drive it on through March and April and May last year was because it was so grim, and my colleagues needed some nourishment amongst really tough times, and to work on this and to make, it helps make the job intellectually interesting. I think they've really loved it, and I'm just really proud that we've actually got something tangible, and it's been great. I've loved every second of it.
No, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, I've written a couple of books, and I know the moment when you finally see it in your hand, all those hours where you spent sort of fretting over how many times you spelt practice wrong, or and all the rest of it is it's an amazing moment. So I'm going to start off by raising a glass to you, because this is if we were in person, we'd be having a beer. So I'm going to crack open the beer, and this is something which. And you've got a humble cup of tea.
I've got a cup of tea.
Well done. Congratulations.
Just a cup of tea. Cheers, Tom.
And I'm sure everyone who's watching. And I think it's important to celebrate these things. It's exciting. And
that's great.
I'll have a drink of that in a minute.
And I'm delighted that people have joined us for this virtual
really
book launch. It's really kind.
So let's get into it. So
Okay.
One of the things I love about this Inaction series is a kind of a mixture of things which people have heard of before, and hopefully it will raise awareness of papers which people haven't heard of before. And in this case, let's be honest, the Collins et al. Paper on cognitive apprenticeship is relatively obscure compared, in terms of general understanding. And yet, when you read it and you see what it's talking about, you think, wow, why doesn't everybody know about this? Because it's so powerful and it's got so many ideas in it. So where did you first come across a Collins paper? And let's deal with the et al. Business, because I always find that I trip over that. Who are the other people? Yeah. And is it really Collins, or is it a genuine sort of collective?
Well, it is. Collins drove it because it first appeared as in 1989, and in 1989 it was with a couple of other people, and then in 1991 it eventually became just the paper as it is, which is Alan Collins, John Seeley Brown, and Anne Holland, all of whom are still alive. When I tracked down Collins at Northwestern University in the States last April, and I worked out, I think he's 83 or 84, and I asked him if he would write a preface for the book, and he said, as long as I survive the COVID outbreak. And thank goodness he did. But the other two are still alive, so I got permission from all three. And what you find out when you start digging around is that it's been in the States at least quite a popular paper that lots of people. There's a whole movement around cognitive apprenticeship. I've had people ask me, is it pure cognitive apprenticeship? Because to the purists that really matters. So there is clearly something out there around cognitive apprenticeship that people are devoted to. But no, so that's where it started, 89 and then 91, and you can find the two different versions. I think I've got a blog somewhere with both versions that you can link to. They're marginally different, but the 99 to 91. Anne Holland was a teacher, and John Seeley Brown is a kind of celebrity thinker in the States. He does all sorts of stuff. Has been in all sorts of different jobs for people. But those three together in 91 published that paper, yeah. But I only found out about it in 2015. The reason I'm so delighted that Kate Darwin's here tonight is because my thinking about writing started in 1988 when I started work. And Kate and I used to beetle along the A27 from Brighton to Eastbourne and back, chatting about our work with both English teachers. And it was in that car that we came up with the idea about how difficult the process of writing is and what a complex process it is. And wouldn't it be interesting to actually, when you think about how we write, we reread what we've just written to write the next sentence. And we created a couple of lessons, no more than that, about thinking between sentences. And it was just, I only found out 25 years later that on 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, Collins et al. Were thinking about the same stuff, about how you teach students how to think when you're an expert at anything, any discipline. So, so my first ideas about it came right at the start of my career. And I just love that in the final 6 months at the end of my career, I'm still working on the same stuff. There's an eternal truth there, isn't there? That you mustn't be that Dylan William magpie trying to find something that works, is going to cure something overnight. If you're going to work really hard on improving your practice, there's no need to go around looking at flashy stuff. Some of it is just hard grind, and is there all the time.
So I think it's worth for people knowing this and tuning in, so that you know that in the book, in John's book, at the back, we've reproduced the whole paper, and you can see it as an appendix, which is great. So I find that a really useful thing to do. So the original paper is, like a lot of these things, quite short, and it gives you the framework. But so when you read the book, or as a lot of people will do, read it, selective chapters and to and fro through a book as people will. The original paper is there to reference. And I'm struck by the fact that it's got a quite helpful subtitle, which is Cognitive Apprenticeship, Making Thinking Visible, which is really sort of nailing it down, a sort of very simple title. So tell us, for people who kind of are thinking, what is this about? And I think it's worth going to that now. We had a question sent to us before about what's the difference between cognitive apprenticeship and, say, metacognition. What do you think, how would you explain to somebody, very simply, what is cognitive apprenticeship? Yeah,
well, I think there's clearly, the roots of the words are both titles are the same, aren't they? It's about cognition, but making thinking visible, I think, is the key to it. But also, when you read stuff about metacognition, I don't know if people have read the ES paper by Alex Quigley on metacognition, who used to work with us. That gives you certain, what you might call heuristics or processes to think through applying knowledge to problem solving. But what Collins does is, and Collins et al. Does in this document, is a much bigger kind of overall package for setting up a learning process. It's not just a tool, it's beyond a tool. So there are 4 dimensions to this, and the first one is content, and that's not just content in terms of knowledge about whatever subject you might be thinking about, but also the knowledge you need about the heuristics you might try to solve a problem, and then the different processes if that doesn't work, and then how you learn. So that's dimension one. Then there's dimension two, which is very much more around some of the stuff we might have been talking about in the last, I don't know, 5 years around metacognition, where all those little strategies around metacognition, and that's illustrated really well. And in this book, that's probably the densest in our book. That's the densest chapter. And then they give a really nice thing around sequencing and how you sequence tasks and how you build learning up. And then lastly, it's about the sociology of learning. So what's it like to be in a classroom where metacognition, where cognitive apprenticeship's going on, and they talk about working as a community of learners. So I don't, it's beyond just metacognitive processes. It's a much wider thing. And what I try to do, and you and I battered this around some, is use 3 or 4 subjects per dimension to illustrate the dimensions. But what you find when we try to do that, and I think it works to some extent in our book, is that all the 4 dimensions, the content, the method, the sequencing and the sociology are so intertwined and interrelated. The very first one in the book, which is one by a guy at our place called Matt Savory, who does biology, he's head of biology at Huntington. I put that one first, and it's in the content section, but actually it's a beautiful example of how all 4 are completely interconnected. And if you get all 4 right, it really works.
Let's tell people a bit about that, because I think it's worth revealing some of the secrets here, which is that the book has ended up in a slightly different shape to how it started. And I think I like the organic feel of this. So what John did to begin with is basically recruited people to write a chapter based on the whole thing. And you didn't really even give that much guidance to it, did you? You just sort of said, how does this idea of making thinking visible apply in your subject? And then people wrote a section. And it was only afterwards we thought about organizing it with the 4 dimensions. So to some extent, it was quite a kind of interesting process to link the subject entry. So before we get into the 4 dimensions, let's just say a little bit about the process of the team writing. How did you select the people to write it? Was it just a self-selected group? Did you ask them all, or were there other heads of department? How did you go about getting the 23 contributors together?
Well, I have a really good sense of people in the school and where people are, and what their interests are, and you kind of know people who are going to bite your hand off if you offer something like this up. And it was something I couldn't. I think it was only one. It was interesting. I think there was one person who rejected it, and I think maybe that's despite everything I try and do at our school, maybe that's a kind of lack of confidence, because lots of people said, "Oh, I couldn't possibly write something." I couldn't do that. And I said, of course you can. And I gave them quite a nice framework. I gave them 3 questions to pin it round. And those 3 questions were, what is the kind of basic fundamental disciplinary thinking in your subject? How do you make that disciplinary thinking visible? And then how do you teach your students how to acquire that thinking? So those were the 3 steps. And I said, look, you've only got 1,000 words, 1,250 maximum, and it was one of those cases where it's much easier to write 5,000 words than it's 1,250. So when I got them all in August, I remember sending them off. I think I showed Kate, and Kate said, you've got a lot of editing to do. I think it was the first roughest draft, and there was a lot of editing to do, just to bring it round into a manageable shape. I would argue that it's probably easier to write your own book of this length than it is to edit. At least you've got control over the style.
But I think it's also true that, and this is what I think is great about this book compared with some others possibly, including most of mine, is that it's specialist as well as being general, which is quite a clever trick. So no one person could possibly write this book, because there's no one person could ever have all the knowledge about all the disciplines in the depth that your colleagues have shown. So I think that's a great thing. And what I think is important to stress is that you don't just read the chapters that you think you're going to recognize and think, I'm going to get something out of the physics chapter because I'm a physics teacher. It's the other way around. I'm thinking you learn so much about thinking and about learning by reading the chapters of subjects you know very little about, because you're thinking, oh God, that's so interesting. I'm constantly been going, having that feeling. They're so thoughtful, so insightful. So by making everyone have a sort of punchy target, you've kind of really pulled it out of the bag. So
but I'll also say that you were really hard-nosed about the number of words I was allowed. So yeah, I was really tough about it. But one of the things that I think about a lot in the last couple of years, and you know this after our conversation recently, is how important it is for senior leaders in schools to know about the curriculum as a whole. I've learned more in editing this book about the curriculum than I have in 18 previous years of headship. I've got a much tighter grasp now of subjects that I line manage. That's a really important obsession with me, and also just the whole breadth of the secondary curriculum and the nuggets are in there. And I can have a much more informed conversation with my colleagues now about how they're structuring their curriculum and curriculum design, just through them writing me 1,500 words or 1,200 words about the real nub of their subject.
Let's get into some of the examples, and I think I like it when there's a simple thing. I mean, I'm an absolute sucker for this sort of structure, and something which you can structure a set of concepts around, which is as clear as this. So, and I think this is where, when people get into this book and start celebrating it even more widely, this idea that cognitive apprenticeship, according to Collins, has got these 4 things. Let's just remind people: there's content, the types of knowledge required for expertise; method, so ways to promote the development of that expertise, slightly different; sequencing, keys to ordering learning activities; and then sociology, social characteristics of learning environments. So content, method, sequencing, and sociology. So 4 areas. And within each one of those, and this is where our colleague Oliver Caviglioli has come in. So we've got these nice sort of illustrations of sort of subsections. Each one of those has got some elements which, and Oliver's done his nice, I should hold up the camera, sort of front page overviews of the key ideas in each one. So let's kick off with content. So how would you, let's choose one of the chapters from content, one of the subjects, and that illustrates the idea of content in cognitive apprenticeship.
Yeah, well, so the first one, I really like the first one. I've been working on it today for my talk on Friday. I'm doing in the curriculum masterclasses. So content overall has 4 subdomains. The domain knowledge, just the content, because in the end, we can have all the arguments you want, and the false dichotomy is about skills versus knowledge. But if you don't have subject knowledge, there is no learning. The bottom line is you've got to know your stuff. And then the key thing about this, it goes back. There's a Gilbert Ryle talk in 1945 where he talks about museum knowledge and workshop knowledge, and how you can have a lot of museum knowledge and have no idea how to apply it and be quite stupid. You can just know stuff, but not have any idea about what to do with it. And then he talks about workshop knowledge, and I think you've got to have the museum knowledge in the first place, but then make it active and then apply it. So you then have heuristic strategies. So generally, and they call that generally applicable techniques for accomplishing tasks. So you've set a problem, how do you work your way through it? And then control strategies. So you've tried a few heuristics, they don't work, you come back, you try another one, that doesn't work, but that's very metacognitive in many ways. And then the learning strategies, how do you commit this to memory? How do you change your long-term memory, which is the core of it. So when you go to Matt Savory's making thinking visible in biology, his is really interesting. He says at the beginning of every teaching, at the beginning of teaching the first A-level topic on cells, I introduce the idea of scale being fundamental to the study of biology. I give the students 10 images of objects, ranging from subatomic particles all the way up to an organism. As the expert biologist, I do not see them as simply 10 independent objects, as a novice might, but items whose properties are also important when you consider the interaction between each layer of the hierarchy. And he introduces all the kind of units in the A-level through looking to begin with scale, and it gives them a heuristic to begin thinking around the concepts in biology. So, and it's a really lovely one because it's a really lovely entry in the book because it actually covers all 4 domains. But that bit of knowledge I really like. So I've been battering him for. He's given me all his slides about how he sets that up. And last summer, last spring before the lockdown a year ago, I was able to work with Matt. I'm going to illustrate this on Friday at the curriculum masterclass. How I go all the way back to 33 years ago with Kate, where what I do for the A-level biology class is learn the biology in real depth on a certain topic, and then I show them how to write and how I think between sentences as I write a piece of A-level biology, and that is what I love about working with people like Matt Savory, who's really interested in his subject and getting better. So that's the first domain, Tom.
Well, that's so interesting, isn't it? Because then as a person reading a book like that, you think, okay, I might be a biology teacher, but I'm not. So what does that mean to me? And I just think you can take so much away from each of the sections. I mean, there are other ones in that content section. Hugh Rich's history is in that section, for example.
Really nice one.
And you've got this brilliant sort of spider planning. And it makes you realize that those things, that domain knowledge, heuristic strategies, control strategies, is such an interesting idea. And I love it when you get something where you think, it just makes total sense. You think, that's a really good way to describe that thing I've always been doing in my teaching. General approaches for directing a solution process. And you realize it's knowledge you have and it's teachable. So it's sort of, you have to just identify that it's not just mysterious or a sort of ephemeral, it's actually definable.
I remember doing Maths A-level. Maths A-level is all about applying what you know, isn't it, to new subjects. And I remember being in my A-level exam, my first A-level exam in 1982, and getting unbelievably stuck after 20 minutes and stopping myself, having 5 minutes rest and starting over again in a different thread. And 40 odd years on, I now realize what I was illustrating was a control strategy.
And I found that when I was helping my son with his Maths A-level, that I'd forgotten some of the domain knowledge, but I hadn't forgotten that what would be called heuristic strategies.
Yeah.
Like and he was a bit sort of, I could just waltz in and help him with his maths without having done it for 20 years. And I was saying, well, because I know I can do it. I know it's the same processes apply. What you do is you look at what you know already, and you look for things like this and this, and then there they are, because you know they're going to be there. Otherwise, the problem wouldn't be solvable. And you have this sort of confidence that, and that's so interesting that you realize that that is a type of knowledge, a type of content to the thinking. I love that. So it makes sense in biology. It makes sense in all of the subjects. And I think the subdivisions are really important. So sometimes ideas get a little bit morphed into oversimplified nuggets, like calling it the dimension of content. I find that it's the 4 definitions of within that are the most useful. What do you think? Is that true? Entirely.
The domains or dimensions, he calls them, when you explore the strands, the 4 strands or 3 strands, or in one of them 6 strands, that's where it really gets interesting. And more granular about when you want to start thinking about. See, the big challenge I think about we're a research school, and Research Ed 2013, Dulwich College launched that with Tom Bennett. I think translating having the golden thread through an evidence paper like Cognitive Apprenticeship all the way through to impacting on student outcomes is the key. and that is at a granular level, really. And it takes a long time. I had just a name drop massively, but I had an hour and a quarter with Professor Rob Coe this morning, just chewing over a few things, and he was illustrating just how difficult it is for CPD of any sort to have any impact on student outcomes down the line 2, 3, 4 years on. And it's the same with like a research paper like this. I think it's quite rare when you look at the research papers you've got in the Inaction series for anything to have that much impact over time, especially on people like me who I had 26 years of ingrained practice. But according to all the researchers, I shouldn't be changing my practice 26 years in. I should have just been cracking on and being dull until the end of my career. But it's been the most energizing.
Works at the level of sort of retrospective validation for things you think you've already been doing well, and it just gives you a framework for understanding what you already do, and sometimes that's useful. And of course, if it makes some shift in your practice which raises outcomes, that's going to be obviously really fantastic. But I feel like it's a long-term process, even as a profession, for us to be more knowing about some of these things. But yeah, I mean, so it is a long road. But let's
dimension two.
The next one, I think, in dimension 2, method. Tell us about method.
Well, when you read dimension 2, and there are 6 strands of dimension 2, and they're modelling, scaffolding, coaching, articulating what you've done and why you've done it, reflecting, and then once you've got all those skills, then exploring. That's all modern stuff, isn't it? You hear that a lot. You hear lots of people talking about those concepts off the back of the big craze about metacognition. Quite right, an absolutely justified craze about metacognition. But some of it seems so relevant, like you said. You kind of 1991. It's 30 years old. This paper, but it's completely up to date in terms of what we're doing, and that's what I like about it too. Is that really good educational concepts last the test of time, don't they? They pass the test of time. And the one I like in this,
I was going to just say them again more slowly, because I think if you haven't got your book in front of you, so there's modelling.
So let me do that again. So there's modelling.
Yeah.
There's modelling. We're quite clear about what modelling is, and I do a lot of modelling in lessons. There's different ways of doing that, but people are quite familiar with modelling. Then scaffolding, so you start to take away some of the scaffolds. Then you coach people, and you kind of do the fading of the support. And then students articulate why they've done what they've done, so you double check that they know, which allows them then to reflect upon performance and compare it to performance of other people. So that comes around a little bit later on to the idea of having a community of learners, and then you fade away, and then you allow students to explore for themselves, having acquired these techniques of modelling, scaffolding, articulating, and reflecting. So it's a really nice.
It's not just that. I hadn't even really clocked that until you said it. That they're actually kind of in order.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they're not just like 6 things. They kind of, there's a process from the modelling to the students and exploring on their own. That's quite neat, isn't it? That's a neat way of just capturing that flow.
Completely, and it's another reason why it's more than just metacognition. It's a whole package. This paper of cognitive apprenticeship.
So give us a chapter example then from method.
Oh, there's a few brilliant ones. I love being in a modern language lesson, because if I go back to modern languages, I took Latin in year 9, but dropped both Latin and French in year 9. And then Lloyd West, my form tutor, said when I was in year 9, if you want to go to university, John, you'll need an O level in a modern language. So I took German from year 10, and I got a CSE grade 1, if you remember them. I did it in 4.5 or 5 terms, and I got a grade 1, which is equivalent to a C at O level. And when I went to do English at York, you needed an O level equivalent grade C to get on the English course. So phew, my German grade 1 CSE got me where I am today. essentially. So I love being in Cherry Bailey's class, who's our phenomenal subject leader of modern languages. And in the original paper, there's a really good example of cognitive apprenticeship in action, solving really hard mathematical equations, and you get a really good example of the chap articulating exactly the heuristics and the control strategies that he's using, and it's really detailed. And what Cherry does in her modern languages is say, ironically, her example of interrogating a piece of German text is much more like solving a maths problem than it is the reading example in the original paper. And so hers is beautiful, and I've watched her do this so many times, how she guides students through how to make really informed guesses and almost, you know, decisions about what key words mean in a sentence. And she gives them a whole load of tools, heuristics and control strategies about how to do that. And it's a beautifully written, because she's a really brilliant writer, a brilliantly written 1,000 words on how she does that.
So she's focusing on the word Stundenlang.
Yeah, which is taking a long time. And she articulates beautifully how she gets students to think that through and come to the meaning of that.
I'm also want to give a shout out to Donal Hale, who is a real. I see him on Twitter all the time, and I think he's as excited about this book as you are.
I think more than that.
If you're listening, Donal, congratulations on your amazing chapter on English.
It's very good.
I found that very interesting indeed. Lots of good examples, from different texts that he's shown.
I spoke about that on the last masterclass, but I'm not going to talk about it on Friday. I'm going to talk about a different example in there. There's a brilliant example I'm going to talk about on Friday at the masterclass about SEND students and analytical writing, and Oliver Cavaglieri might just get a mention because there's a bit of dual coding going on in there as well.
Yeah, with good diagrams. So for me, the method there is good, and it's I actually can see those 6 elements of that. There's a couple of things which I don't think I've really thought about before, like this, and express it in the same way. Articulation. The teacher encourages students to verbalize their knowledge and thinking. So I would, in the past, I think I'd have called that, say, check for understanding. So can you explain the method yourself? But I like the idea of getting them to articulate the method. There's something a bit deeper about that, because it suggests that they have to run through the sequence. I think that's something I've always done. I've shown you how this set of equations works in maths. Tell me how you think it works. Can you now explain it? Or a procedure in science or something. But I think it's because articulation means more than just saying it, doesn't it? It means expressing it clearly, fully, in a logical order. There's something deep about that, and I really like that. Okay, so there's so much in it, and what I think is a bit like one of the things I learned from Martin Robinson on a masterclass that he did was that he says, for example, you learn more by, say, studying 2 paintings by comparing them than you do one at a time. So if I'm looking at that painting and that painting, carefully selected for good reasons, I can see why that one is different, and it's in comparison. The same with 2 texts or 2 poems or something. And I think the comparison of the different stories within each of these dimensions makes you understand the idea more deeply, because you're thinking, oh, okay, that's how it's expressed in English. That's how it's expressed in German, and it just makes you process the idea in a more rigorous way. Let's move on. So the 3rd dimension is
sequencing.
Sequencing. Tell us what sequencing is.
So key sequencing has 3 different substrands. So first one is global before local skills. So look at the big picture, and then you break it down into the constituent parts, and you learn it bit by bit by bit. Increasing complexity. So not unfamiliar with lots of us, especially if you do maths or a subject like maths, where you're increasing the difficulty of the tasks, and then broadening the task as well in diversity. But the sequencing, and then overall the keys to ordering learning activities and ordering the sub-strands of each of the elements of a piece of learning. And my favourite entry here is the food entry by none other than Gary Littlewood, who is, if there was something above what a god is, he'd be whatever that, you know, he's just superhumanly brilliant. And if you could come and watch Gary teach food, it's phenomenal. And what I love about it, because he's a funny man as well, and we have, you know, what I love about working at Huntington is that I feel like I'm a round peg in a round hole. I can be entirely myself when I'm working with colleagues, because we just have a lot of fun. But he's a brilliant food teacher. This is his disciplinary principle that underpins all successful food teaching. And he says it's think like a scientist and demonstrate like an artist. It is perhaps more explicitly expressed in the following phrase, brackets, which sounds like a Chinese proverb: rescue a lumpy sauce to send a student home with a decent macaroni cheese. Teach a student about gelatinization and they'll make perfect sauces for life. Which I just absolutely love. It sounds like a Confucian proverb. It's brilliant. But what was interesting about working with Gary, because when I asked the original questions for my colleagues, they came back with lots of generic answers. So I say, you know, what's the disciplinary thinking in your subject? And they'd say modelling. I said, yeah, but that's not discipline. We all do modelling in one way or the other. Most of us do modelling one way or the other. But what is it in terms of disciplinary terms for your subject? And Gary went away and came back and went away and came back. And we had a brilliant and professional dialogue. And what he realised was, when he really thought about when he teaches children how to cook, he does a brilliant demonstration, is that one of the key things is to be 3 steps ahead all the time. If you're a chef, or you cook food, you're always 3 steps ahead all the time. You're always thinking 3 steps down the line about, if I'm doing that, then that's going to happen, and that's going to be going on while I'm doing this, and then that happens, and I've got to check that and do this. And then he said, understanding the sensory profile required to monitor and evaluate the process almost subliminally. How you use most of your senses, the smell, sound, vision, your eyes, to check on what's happening to the food. And then lastly, it's the science of it. So people can treat food as quite lightly sometimes, but if you understand the science of how the ingredients react to different situations, then if you understand that, when something goes wrong and your senses have said, the alarm bells have gone off, the sensory alarm bells have gone off, then actually, if you understand what's happening to the science, you can intervene really quickly and resolve things. So when you read Gary's, it's 1,250 words of pure genius, all about making a white sauce. It's really brilliant. And I've watched him.
I think it's one of the first ones it's one of the first ones that you suggested, because it had this sort of, it was good to sort of bring a practical subject into the fold, which sometimes isn't the case in some books. These things, BT gets left out and things that happens too often. And I think to talk about a practical process, and I think it resonates for a lot of people who've tried to cook and found it slightly mysterious. But then it does explain kind of how you get to think 3 steps ahead, because you can't stay 3 steps ahead unless you know the steps, obviously. And that takes some experience, which links to this idea of global before local. I really think that's an important idea. I suppose I always try to link it to things I would have said. I talk about sort of big picture, small picture. Like if you're learning a dance, you need to see the whole dance really before you know why you do any of the steps. So even though you really learn it step by step, you know where they all go because you've seen the whole thing. And I remember being really frustrated as a young musician in orchestras, thinking we start playing these pieces. I had no idea what they're supposed to sound like, because I'm thinking, I don't even know what it sounds like. What are we playing? So I always wanted to hear it. Like, what is it supposed to sound? Can we hear it on tape first or something? Because then you get a feel for what it's meant to be that you're doing. So that to me is so interesting, that you set the scene and then you can start talking about that.
And Cherry Bailey does that brilliantly in modern languages, because she's revolutionised the teaching modern languages at our place. And I've always watched modern language lessons, which seem to be lots of little activities that build up. And what Cherry does is start with a big piece of text. She starts with the big picture and then unpicks it, and they learn the grammar rules through unpicking the big piece of text, rather than practicing these small activities which don't always build up to anything much. You just feel like you've just done a load of activities in 45, 50 minutes, and then the lesson's ended and you're not really sure what you've learned. She gives them heuristics and control strategies to unpick a big piece of text and work backwards and down to the rules, rather than giving them the rules to then look at a piece of text. It's really good.
I really like the math section here, because there's so many things. It's just so interesting. It covers, Matt Smith has written about how, I love this story about some students in a maths paper where they're asked to expand 4 lots of x minus 3, which the student does without any trouble. And then the next question is expand and simplify something very similar, and he couldn't do it at all. So he's sort of saying, that kind of thing of like solving a problem. Why is it that the student can't see the connection? And he talks about variation theory and how you need to increase complexity and teach students to not be afraid of that, but sort of see the steps, see how complexity is just subtle increments of extra bits of connection being made. And I like the PE one, because that's a bit like the dance story that's about gymnastics. It's almost exactly the same.
Oh, and the PE one gives a whole new kind of resonance to the forward roll, right? So, forward roll, old school PE, but actually the way Nigel Curry unpicks the forward roll in that, and how he unpicks metacognitively, how he teaches it is extraordinary. But Matt is taking over from me in September for a year. He's deputy at Huntington, the mathematician Matt Smith. But what I love about the school as well is that we're all teachers, and we're all massively into our craft and trying to work out how we make ourselves better year in, year out at the margins. That
comes through. So he's stepping into your shoes.
Amazing. Yeah.
So look, let's go for the last one. I think this last one to me is just mind blowing. I love the fact that this is in as a set of ideas that is now in the sphere of education research, which I suppose personally I feel like I've neglected entirely in my thinking. The sociology. This idea of social characteristics of learning environments. It comes through things like Nuttall's Hidden Lives of Learners and things, some resonances with that. But I think this is really interesting that they're saying that this is part of a cognitive apprenticeship, that there is this, essentially, there's a social dimension to it. So tell us what this is all about.
Yeah, well, if you think about, the whole thing is about how you take the traditional apprenticeship and make it in an educational setting, and apprentices who would work in a factory or whatever, as a group of budding carpenters or whatever, would all work together to look at it, and that's the fundamental concept here. So you've got, I don't always find this bit easy. One of the things about the book that I like, about the paper that I like. And I'm just going to find the quotation because I highlighted it earlier. Collins and his team concluded that ultimately it's up to the teacher to identify ways in which cognitive apprenticeship can work in his or her own domain of teaching. Right? It's not a prescription for everybody. You have to find a way that works for you. And I think that's really important. And I find situated learning, where you're learning in the context of realistic tasks, I find not always helpful sometimes, but they give a really good example and a really good reason why that should be. But the community of practice I really like, the intrinsic motivation about setting your own skills and targets and solutions, and then the whole sense of cooperation and that people work together to achieve their goals. And if you get that climate right in a classroom, where you go in and you think actually every single student in here respects each other, is working for each other, shares their expertise and helps each other improve, it's just the most beautiful thing to see. And the one I like in here that I've talked about before is Cassie Garbutt's example in art, And when you watch Cassie teach, she has an atmosphere of utterly mutual respect for every student respects everybody else's attempt to be an artist, and she gives a really brilliant 6-stage way of teaching portraits, and she says over 6 lessons, this is the thinking processes of portraiture are made visible, and following Collins et al.'s mantra. While each student practices soloing, the teacher, as well as other students, evaluate the soloist's performance. So you have a very structured way of critiquing each other's work, and it's really brilliantly structured. You begin with a teacher demo, then you have a teacher and then student A, teacher student B, teacher student C demo, then the students one after the other demo, and then you have individual composition. And then you have students presenting their work for critique at the end. And it's beautifully articulated in 6 very short but clearly written examples.
No, and I think that's interesting. I mean, sometimes you have to look at context. Some theories of learning are about would apply in a one-to-one context. So how do I teach someone just to teach them? But most of the time in a school context or a college context, we are in a community of practice, and you can either just sort of treat it as a bunch of individuals who are in the same room, or you can say, well, actually, no, it's more than that. We're all here talking about maths. We're all here talking about science. We're all here watching this demo. We're all here learning about painting and harnessing that. So harnessing the collective aspect sometimes gets sort of, well, how do we do that? We talk about collaborative learning, and sometimes that means that they have to produce things together. But here, in this example, you see that they're all doing their own work, but they're doing it as a community of artists doing their own individual work, but in the same space and using that. I think it's so well bridged, that whole idea.
And with a responsibility almost for helping each other get better. I mean, that's why there's almost a collective spirit of we're all going to get better at this, and we're going to help each other get better at it. And that's what I love about that example.
Yes, it just deals with the reality of life in school, doesn't it? And you either use that as a positive. So I do think it's interesting. I think the situated one is interesting, that situated learning, students learn in the context of working on realistic tasks. It depends, doesn't it? It depends on what that is. And sometimes there is learning from, for example, in science, when you do electrical circuits where every circuit is in straight lines with rectangles, and you've just done a neat thing, it becomes like a sort of problem solving thing, like Sudoku or something. When you're actually trying to make the bloody voltmeter work, and you're trying to measure something for real, it takes on a whole new world, even though it's sort of nominally the same basic idea. The reality of it, the real worldness of it is different. And I do think that you're applying knowledge in a different way, and it's important. It's part of it.
The other one that I think where it happens a lot is in this section for the religion, philosophy, and ethics by Robin Parmenter.
Yeah,
I'm going to talk about that on Friday a bit more. But we introduced into year 10 an hour a week in a preciously tight timetable, a philosophy for life course. And we think that's really important. And so what Robin does at the beginning of the course is ask students what they think happiness is and what they think a good life lived is. And then he introduces it, goes all the way back to the Stoics, introduces them to all the major philosophers through the age, Frankl and people, Nietzsche. And at the end, ask them the same question. So, what now do you think is a life worth living, and a life well lived, and what is happiness? And they change massively over that year's course. And so there you've got a community of practice, because he's brilliant at creating the conditions for talk and discussion. But they're actually the situated learning is their life. It's a brilliant place to finish the book. I deliberately put that one last because it's beyond the academic in a way on what they learn there. It's there. We have that in there because we believe as a learning community there is something more than just what we do in the classroom in terms of learning about life and preparing people for the years ahead.
Wow, great. So look, I think, looking at the time there, it's a great introduction. It's got 4 neat sections. Each one has its own sort of subdivisions of concepts, and the way that the book has these 23 sections laced through it really brings the ideas off the page. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. And then you've got the original paper to follow up in the book, and I really think teachers who read it will get a lot out of it. We've got a bit of time for questions, just to see if anyone has answered it. We've got chat function, if you want to use the chat function there. But I should have probably asked that before, but so people could do it during the session. Just as if people have got questions, we'll just wait for that to come in. But meanwhile, I just want to just...
The other feature I'd say about it is, because we're a research school, I asked Jane Ellsworth, our director of research school, who co-writes the geography section, but she also did an evidence review. And thinking about Javinia's question earlier about why is this different from metacognition, it's a really nice analysis of where this paper sits within. You go back to 1976 and Flavel's first use of the word metacognition, all the way through to Alex Quigley's work in 2018 on metacognition and papers since then. So it situates it beautifully, it positions it beautifully in context of the whole body of work around cognitive processes.
Well, I think that's what's so exciting about this whole world. There's overlaps but in all 3 of these Inaction books so far, there's overlaps in some of the thinking, and certainly in terms of anything you actually then end up doing differently in a classroom. They're mutually reinforcing, I think, because they sort of deepen your understanding, challenge it a little bit. But what's good about this is it does, although all the books have got examples, that these are sort of very tight examples from lots of different people. And to some extent, all of the books are examples. So Alice has asked, the main headings for the sections of method.
Yeah, this is where I garbled, Alice. I'm sorry. Let me go through those again. So the first one is modelling. So pretty clear what that means. And then after modelling, there's scaffolding, which is to support the students to complete the task. Then coaching, where you see students work on their own. Then getting students to articulate the processes that they've learned. Then the teacher shows students how to reflect upon performance and almost self-evaluate what they've done. And then the teacher guidance is faded and they explore. Exploration is the last one. So it's modelling, scaffolding, coaching, articulate, reflect, and exploration. That process going all the way through, which is possibly, as you said, Tom, possibly the most detailed, useful sequence of that type that I've seen.
Diagram coming to you.
There you go. Beautiful diagram as well.
Page 50, you'll see it. So look, thank you so much for people joining us. Just so as a heads up, people who are interested in this stuff, the next books in the series, we have a Nimish lad who's written a great book about Arthur Shimomura's Marge paper, The Whole Brain Model of Learning. Kate Jones is doing one on Dylan, William and Siobhan Leahy's work on formative assessment strategies, and Dylan has been very closely scrutinizing that, as you can imagine. He's read that, and in fact, to be fair, all of the people have done that. So Art Shimomura has been involved, and coming soon in behind that is Sonia Thompson, has written a book about Ron Berger's An Ethic of Excellence, and that's very interesting because it's slightly backwards in the sense that Ron Berger's work is sort of almost the inaction itself, and then they're sort of going back and saying, what's the kind of research that backs up that, and it's sort of, but it's connected. So and Ron Berger has also been aware of that and writing a forward and the rest of it. So all the people are closely involved. They love the fact that their books are being talked about. So that's coming up sort of over the next couple of months, and then there'll be 6. But just to celebrate, raise a glass to John and all your colleagues. Congratulations.
Cheers.
My beer's empty. I have to fit it up. But honestly, it's a huge achievement. I'm really impressed with the whole thing.
Thank you.
And I hope everyone involved is really proud of what you've done. It's a fantastic thing. And a kind of nice thing for you, sort of hanging up your boots at Huntington that you created this book.
Yeah, all I want, my leaving present is a signed copy by every contributor. That's all I need.
And those of you who are lucky enough to get a ticket for Friday's masterclass with John, he's going to be talking about that further. But
in much more
thank you
detail.
so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, everyone.
And people watching online, you know, hope you enjoyed that, and keep in touch. And I'm sure John will take your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye then.